Welcome to the latest episode of The Business of Government, a special podcast series for The Hub. This week, a look at the politics and policies shaped by nudge thinking, or the use of behavioral psychology to shape outcomes. Nudges have been used successfully for decades now, but are they being used as well as they could? And in this ever polarized world, is a nudge a little too delicate to get the job done? Michael Hallsworth is managing director of the BIT Americas, a leading behavioral insights consultant, which grew out of a unit of the UK government in the early 2000s. He's also author of the book, Behavioural Insights. So, Michael, I want to start with, nudge got a lot of attention, obviously, including, really important economics prizes in terms of how it could be used by government. Where are we with it? We know it's alive and well, and there's definitely some recent evidence of its use, including in pandemic. How would you say characterize where it is on its journey?
Yeah, sure. So the book Nudge came out in 2008, and it really sparked a lot of interest in this field. But you have to remember there had been interest building in other senses as well. So government's been kind of increasingly receptive to use behavioral science. The financial crisis had kind of made them look for other options as well about doing things, particularly ones that didn't cost a lot of money. And that meant that there have been a broader kind of trend to being interested in behavioral science. Nudge was really like the catalyst, the spark that lit the flame, and it got a lot of attention. But what's been clear over the last 15 years is there's been a kind of behavioral science, behavioral insights movement that has been applied in the public sector that is broader than the concept of nudge. And it's just worth being aware of this, because the idea of nudge is one where you basically set up options so people are more likely to choose one that benefits themselves, but they're free to choose otherwise. It's kind of created to appeal both to left and right, but it also has certain limitations. It says that like legislation, taxation, they're off the agenda. We don't look at those. Now, of course, what's happened is that there's been a broader application which says, well, behavioral science is a body of kind of knowledge, a way of doing things, a way of understanding human behavior that can be applied, for example, to improve the way taxation works, improve the way legislation works, rather than saying it's nothing to do with that. So where we are right now is we've had a tremendous amount of success. There's been a lot of attention, a lot of investment. There have been 300 separate kind of institutional teams set up around the world to draw on this body of knowledge. That has a kind of ecosystem has grown up. What I think now is we are moving into a new phase of maturity, where we know, roughly speaking, what kind of size of improvement we can get from a certain type of intervention. We also know that we need to kind of broaden out the way we're thinking about behavioral science, rather than just sort of thinking about, nudges and the fact that people often react in non-conscious ways. There's a broader agenda here around people's goals, motivations, and so on that we can take into account. And so I think we are moving into that phase. We've made the case for behavioral science. People have shown and know it can make a difference. And now it's a question of how much difference does it make? What's the right option in which circumstance? How much difference does it make for different populations? That additional level of sophistication and maturity is where we're at now after about 15 years.
And I think that's a really great distinction to make, especially because I think a lot of us have maybe retained a more simplistic view of how behavioral science can be used. Is it safe to say that there are now, and I'm going to oversimplify a little bit here, but so forgive me, but is it safe to say that there are now almost two kind of categories, and one would be behavioral science as it relates to the user or consumer or recipient of information or policies, but also this growing body that I think you might be part of how you use behavioral science and the understanding of it to build complex systems, of which governments are one, right? They're internally, departments are super, super complex. And which of those two do you think is kind of the more, I hate to say important, but where is sort of the fun work being done?
There are a few different ways of cutting this. And you can think about the emphasis on like individuals and systems, or you can think about the emphasis on like policy or government itself. The flexibility is kind of quite helpful, I would say. So a few different angles. I think there's a massive underappreciated opportunity here to improve the way government works itself. And about 5 years ago, I did a whole kind of report, set of recommendations on how you might do this called behavioural government. And it basically took the point that, in behavioural science, behavioural policy, nudge, we've been very much talking about how does government sort of do things, if you like, to people in a very simplistic sense. How does it set policies up? But actually, policymakers, government departments are as much they use the same mental shortcuts that we all do.
Right.
They're not immune to that. So governments are over optimistic, in terms of their plans. Large projects go over budget. There is groupthink. When people are in the room, in small groups, they tend to reinforce what each other is thinking, and decisions become more extreme. Some people say, oh, that means that government should just get out of the business of trying to influence behavior because it's not perfect. I disagree. I think there are ways you can build institutions differently, change the way they work to make these kinds of, if you like, biases less likely to happen. It requires an institutional approach, though. Like, for example, building in breakpoints where you say, like, let's reassess the assumptions. There's an idea called pre-mortems, where instead of a post-mortem, where you work out what went wrong, you try to work out what could go wrong in advance. You give people the license to think about those doubts in the back of their mind and bring them out.
So one of the things, this is a little tangential, but I feel like it's important to introduce this concept fairly, and that is, I was looking at some data on how journalists, the media, anybody who should be in a kind of a quasi-critical role of how policies are developed and implemented, have been interestingly tilted in favor of the use of behavioral techniques and psychology, nudge, if you will. And that, we could say, well, that's because it's all common sense. But it can also be alarming that it feels like a smart thing for governments to do, and that therefore we're maybe a little less healthily critical about how it might be abused, because of course it's ripe for abuse. Do you think we're in the right place on how we think about it in terms of how benign we assume it will be?
Great question. So few ways of thinking about it. I cannot obviously control what everyone else does with behavioral science. If you like, if the genie's out of the bottle in a way, and people will know that these kind of ideas exist, and so like many tools, they can be used for better or worse purposes. I do know that the field of behavioral science has been thinking about ethics and what were appropriate kind of ways of dealing with that. My view is that you can't deal with that kind of stuff in the abstract. You need a kind of framework that allows you to work through the case in front of you and work out the costs and benefits involved, and what people have a strong intention in a particular instance that needs to be respected, for example. So I think that's a real concern. I think part of the reason that people haven't maybe been as critical as we wondered they would be, maybe at the start of all this, is because they've actually seen that a lot of the applications by governments have been fairly uncontroversial. Mm-hmm. They've been things like, helping people to pay their taxes on time. They've been more kind of banal things that are really important in terms of making government work, but they haven't strayed into those more controversial areas because I think some of the guardrails have been there. There are bigger concerns, you might say, around, for example, tech companies have a vast amount of data with a lot of precision. They also can employ what's known as dark patterns. So this is around building your online environment to encourage you to spend, to keep you hooked and so on. Now, there's very little kind of awareness of that because the data and the techniques are often held by private companies. And I think there is increasing interest in that because people know that behavioral science can be powerful. It varies by context, but it can be, and it can be used for these purposes, which maybe people didn't sign up for. So it's a really complex area right now. I think there are reasons it can be dangerous. I think in the past, people have been positive about it because it's been less controversial. but that doesn't mean it won't be in the future.
Well, I guess one place where we do see, and it's muted criticism relative to the way temperatures have been around this subject, but we know that the UK government, for instance, and others did use some behavioral psychology around vaccine mandates, around health mandates in the pandemic. Do you see some of those as an appropriate use? Because I guess what I would say is, the dovetail question that I would ask is whether the danger of trying to use some of these understandings is an oversimplification, because in order to to fit them neatly into a proposition, you do sort of have to distill things down to very simple. Now, maybe the public needs things simplified, and we can't actually lay complex problems before a broad citizenship and hope that they come to the right answer. I don't know, but we certainly didn't see a lot of that. We saw oversimplifications of big complex problems during pandemic. Is that the only way to do it? And does behavioral sort of economics lend itself to that?
I'm not actually aware of behavioral economics related to like vaccine mandates or anything. A mandate really can be just a very simple kind of use of the power of the state, if you like. It doesn't require any behavioral economics input. What I do think is that over the course of 10, 15 years, there has been a drive to increase understanding of behavioral science in government by me and others, because we've taken the view that if you want evidence-based policy, there is evidence about human behavior, and it makes sense to people to know the right, evidence that is actually accurate, as opposed to assumptions. In that process, you may have to simplify. Like if I say to you, most people are, sorry, let me start that again. If I say to you, most people are influenced by what others do in the same situation. This is like a social norm point.
Right.
Have you considered social norms? I am simplifying here. Sometimes people aren't. It depends what group you're referring them to. If that's a group they admire or one they really don't like, that you can have opposite reactions. Now, if I go around saying that, what may come through is the kind of quite basic understanding that you should do this. And that, if misapplied or applied in the wrong way with good intentions, can lead to a worse outcome. So I think there's something in that. Like, I think the broader awareness has been achieved, but that doesn't mean you're automatically going to get a good outcome. So I think that is a risk. I think overall the benefit's been positive. You've got a positive net benefit, but those risks are there.
One thing that did occur to me is that as we see increased use of machine learning technologies, artificial intelligence, married up with some of these tools, and they are tools, and some of them have been quite well developed. Is there sort of a new wrinkle in this puzzle? And in fact, do people like you even worry about losing control, I guess, of how these things evolve?
So I definitely think there is a question here. And I think it goes back maybe to the ethical appropriateness question. My concern is that a lot of the time machine learning has been spoken about in like a technocratic way, like look at the new things we might be able to do. We can combine behavioral science with machine learning to create targeted interventions that are really effective, or we can test to see how effective they are. But there is I think a prior question about what are the bounds of acceptability here? What do people want? How do you prevent it being creepy? How do you prevent it being inappropriate? Because governments have tended to offer services at scale for everybody. What level of personalization are we comfortable with from government, which is funded by general taxation normally? I don't think there is a technical answer to those questions. I think it's a political one. But I don't know who's having that debate, to be honest with you. And I think it is an important one. What kind of, for example, in many countries, men pay more than women for car insurance. And we sort of accept that. But if you were to look at other demographic or characteristics paying more for something, you wouldn't feel as comfortable. So this feels like a massive unknown debate that should be had really before you start thinking about let's do these really targeted interventions.
Do you believe in a philosophical way that when we think about just using, I'm going to keep saying nudge, but I know that it's bigger than nudge. It's more complex than that. But using behavioral tools and psychology, it kind of lends itself to a big government mentality. Is it antithetical to say I believe in a small, lean government that will leave me alone much of the time? But when I do relate to it, it may be using some of these policies. How do you see that kind of tension?
I don't think that's necessarily true. And I would say that rather than seeing behavioral science as a tool necessarily, I think it's better to see it as a lens through which you see actions. And I mean this because I think it also can lead you to reassess things. So it may lead you to say, well, actually, the solution here is not to have an intervention. Actually, that may not be the best thing. Or it may lead you to realize, actually, an existing intervention we have is counterproductive. Now we think about how it's actually going to influence behavior. Or it may lead you to say, rather than trying to change behavior, let's design a policy around people's existing behaviors. I also think there is a strand of the way behavioral science has been applied, which is about making sure that public money is used wisely or effectively, because the way this has grown up has been around testing things. We can't assume, given behavior is complex, that something is going to have a particular effect. So we always kind of try and test it and scrutinize it. And I think that's a non-partisan approach as well, because it may lead you to conclude that something doesn't work. And I have been in situations where I've said, this thing we tried didn't work. That is not the same as saying, like, you just keep doing more and more and make your government bigger. That's like taking a kind of reassessing approach to government. So I don't think it's a simple thing as it means a bigger government at all, actually. It can be used in various ways.
And I guess to your point, it can be used to really improve the existing delivery of services. Is it being used that way? I mean, is this one of the tools governments are using worldwide, governments that are thinking this way about trying to be better?
Yes. So, for example, in the US, certainly, over the last 8 years, as an organization, we've spent a lot of time working with governments to improve their ability to run rapid trials and experiments. This is through the What Works Cities program from Bloomberg Philanthropies, which actually is now expanding to Canada. It works with cities to help them use data and experimentation to improve the way they deliver services and understand what effects they're having. So I do think it can be really kind of integral. I don't see this as a kind of nice to have. I think it can be really kind of central to the way governments work, because most policy and most service provision is intended to have some kind of behavioral effect. Like, you want people to put their bins out at the right time. If you're a city, you want people to pay their taxes on time. Focusing that way, understanding what the effects are through testing, and through even doing strategies that take this stuff into account, is kind of the core thing that government should be doing, in my view.
So one of the more depressing facts I learned about behavioral psychology when it came to personal finance is that education, teaching people more about personal finance, which has been the goal in many people's worlds for a long time, then they'll get better at it, we think, isn't actually one of the most effective tools. Even when people know more about it, they still don't behave better about it, which is, to me, quite depressing. Maybe given everything you know about human beings, you take that in stride. But that kind of reality about our human limitations, to me, says, if we take this to its extreme, if we continue to kind of build out systems that really respond well to how limited and fragile and vulnerable our own behaviors and brains are, the way our brains actually interact with our world and experiences, we actually will get further and further away from a kind of empowerment that has to do with our understanding of why we're doing things. I know that's a very extreme view, but do you see that as a continuum where it kind of leads people away from real agency?
I actually don't think that, because I don't think the distinction is as clear. So for two reasons. One, behavioral science can be used to improve education. So this is the idea of, if you like, a boost, which is kind of framed as an alternative to nudge. Although, it's a range of options you choose from. And that's where you teach people how to use mental shortcuts or develop mental shortcuts so they achieve behaviors that fulfill their goals. So it might be, for example, using entrepreneurs who are just starting out, helping them use simple rules of thumb, mental shortcuts about organizing their accounts. And that has been shown to work better than traditional education. It's harnessing the processes that behavioral science uncovers. And the other thing I would say is that if you expand on that, behavioral science can be used to sort of empower people more generally. If people are aware of actually what produces a certain behavior, they can kind of invest in that. So if you find that, for example, redesigning your environment in small ways is much more effective than relying on willpower, I'm not disempowering you by telling you that fact. In fact, I would say the opposite. I'm helping you do something more effective by taking into account the fact that we tend to overestimate how we will resist temptation, for example, or we tend to overestimate our ability to use willpower when we're confronted with different options. That for me is empowerment, helping people understand the role of their own, how behavior comes about from them, and then addressing that.
I guess I'm thinking more of an example, and I think it's a real life example, maybe not, but it's one that I've seen often, of making the glasses smaller in the bar, so that at the pub, so that people drink less unwittingly. And you're actually charging them less. You're not stealing or anything, but you are changing their behavior without their permission or without their knowledge. There are some of us who would say, well, that's great because I didn't notice, and so I guess I don't need as much. But there are others who will say, I didn't make that choice, and they just rebel against that. And I feel as though that category is pretty big these days of people that certainly in our country we feel, and in the US, I think that's safe to say, there are people who simply don't want official agencies, whether that's the government or other bodies of authority, telling them what to do, and they certainly don't want it happening without their knowledge.
I think the first question is, who is we? Because what definitely has happened is that portion sizes have increased over the last 40 years. Now, the question is whether, were people consulted? What form of consultation would you like? It's more like the market decided that people wanted to buy it, advertising simulated demand, and so on. So there's a real question about who is making the decision here. And is it what level of scrutiny do we have on one side or the other side? Because if you are saying that maybe bars are offering smaller glasses and charging less, I think that's just the equivalent of them offering bigger glasses or offering a bigger burger. I found out recently that Wendy's introduced the triple burger to get people to buy the double burger, and it was a massive success. This is, in behavioral science, it's called the decoy effect. So this kind of stuff's happening all the time. What are we okay with? When do we react badly to that? Or when do we just say, oh, well, that's just more choice or a different kind of choice? You're right, though, the reactance, as we call it, being really annoyed at being deprived of a choice, is a very real thing. And it's not always predictable about when people are going to get really annoyed about it. That's why I think it's really important to try and test some of the stuff in advance on a small scale, get people's reactions rather than just assuming, because we can't always predict this. And you're right, it's a danger. And it's a problem we need to be aware of. We need to see the world as it is.
I guess on that front, I've wondered whether the political polarization, you sort of alluded to this earlier, and I won't know the right behavioral science term for it, but that we do identify with groups seems to be a problem that needs to be addressed. If we're trying to kind of help people get to certain places or make certain decisions, when the polarization is the sort of group identity politics is as strong as it is today, are there fixes for that? Are there things you think that governments are actually doing and thinking about to try to help reverse that a little bit? Great question.
There's no doubt that the post-rationalization of stuff is really powerful. There are experiments showing that you are less likely to solve a kind of simple maths question if the answer goes against your political preconceptions. Like you're just like
Terrible.
it's very powerful. Now, how do you deal with some of those things? Well, there have been some successful attempts to bridge groups. There's a really amazing study done by Betsy Pollack at Princeton around using the power of soccer, football, to bring together Israeli and Palestinian children, that in an evidence-based way, bridging those kind of potential divides. You can create new groups that, although they're very kind of contingent, can actually be effective. You can also have things called deliberative forums, where people get in there and they don't, rather than just arguing against each other, they have to engage with some kind of evidence. Over time, people's opinions do begin to shift as they get further under the surface. And sometimes just asking people to explain how they think something works can lead people to pause and reconsider. Because it actually turns out that you and me and everyone, we can find this really difficult to actually explain something. There's this thing called the illusion of explanatory depth, where we think we know how things work. And then when we actually try and work it through, we go, okay, interesting, I actually don't. So that can lead to some openness. So there are pointers, but it's a really tough area.
Well, I'm curious to know whether you think, given how much is going on still in this field, and how, to your point, and I know you wrote a kind of a manifesto about where this science can go and things that people should be thinking about. And to me, there's a lot of optimism that we can bring to what this might do for us. Understanding our human frailties, I think our neurological frailties seems like a really good place to kind of focus when we're trying to make things work better. Can we be optimistic that that will actually help? This is a political question almost, so forgive me, but help us out of the place we're in, which is, it seems sometimes like a very dire, negative place of polarization, of conflict and oppositional behaviors by groups. Is this, will our own self-knowledge help us out of it?
So my answer would be that it's not just about understanding frailties, it's also about understanding strengths. The rapid and non-conscious way we make judgments can also be very effective at helping us navigate our lives.
Right. Good point.
That's the first. The second thing is, I think it can help us it helps us redirect our energies to the stuff that might actually influence behavior. So what I mean by that is the kind of organizations in which we make decisions, the processes that, without even realizing it, take us in certain directions. That, I think, offers some hope. There's a lot of work that's been done around something called conversational receptiveness as well, by Julia Minson at Harvard. And that offers a route, for example, that is about having more effective conversations. So like, rather than just, I give my opinion and I think you're wrong, and I'm going to try and convince you of it by hammering into your head, conversational receptiveness is about saying there are certain phrases that can open up the conversation and prevent that kind of defensiveness that will come about by someone's challenging my whole identity, and I'm going to react by just putting up the defenses. Now, I think that's a chink of light. I think there are ways you can have a better conversation if you understand what leads to that defensiveness occurring, and it can be small things, which also means small things can point you in the opposite direction. So I think there is some hope from the behavioral sciences, but part of the solution has got to be just the hard political ones of de-escalating some of the polarization as well.
So just bringing it back then to governments and where they are in their kind of thinking evolution of this, that seems like a really useful place for the political side of government to be thinking. Of course, they may feel they benefit more from some of the polarization out there, some of the conflicts. Do you think governments are in a good place in terms of how they're using behavioral sciences?
I mean, that's a really big question. I think it varies. Like, it obviously varies. I think that what has definitely happened is the base level of awareness about some of the main insights has increased. So I think people will have more pause rather than just putting together really poorly thought out policy. I think one criticism is that maybe we still haven't got into the really big policy issues and trying to influence those through behavioral science. And I think that's fair, because I think a lot of the time we've focused on changing specific aspects of how things are done so we can show that they had an impact. Like, you change this, you get that impact. But of course, a lot of these big problems are embedded in really big complex systems. I think there is potential here from behavioral science, because you can focus on particular behaviors in a system that can then spread change in unpredictable ways throughout the system. And I think that's a way forward, which I really would encourage governments to embrace. And, I've set out how they might do that in really kind of practical ways.
It's so good to have you for this, Michael. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Up next on The Business of Government, making hard choices. We're talking to people who know firsthand the cost of making tough decisions in government.